Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony. This Saturday bonus episode is a recording of an interview we gave on another podcast. Regular Words and Numbers episodes come out each Wednesday.
Hey, welcome everybody. This is John Paul Mendoza. This is It's a Paul World. We have a very special guest today. In fact, he is going to talk about some very interesting topics. I think they're interesting topics, especially if you're worried about your wealth and where the economy is going and all those. And hopefully he'll answer that and many more. And welcome in Antony Davies. Davies? Did I say it right?
Davies, yes.
Davies.
Yes.
Antony Davies. Antony, welcome to.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit about, who you are and what you do and all that. Cause you may not be a household word yet, but we're going to try to help that along.
Yeah, I'm a professor of economics at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and I co-host the podcast Words and Numbers, and have recently written a book, Cooperation and Coercion, How Busybodies Became Busy Bullies and What That Means for Economics and Politics.
Antony, since you are in the university system, how much pressure do you get from the academic world for your beliefs and your ideas?
Surprisingly little, but I count myself as an exception to the rule. Duquesne is a Catholic university, and Catholic universities tend to err on the side of pursuing truth wherever it leads. So although I'll have faculty who will look askance at me, generally speaking, I haven't had any problems. But unfortunately, I'm an exception, not the rule.
So let's talk about your new book that is out, and we'll have it at FreedomFest, I assume. So when people want to clamor for it after this, talk about the book and its genesis.
I co-authored this with my colleague James Harrigan, who's a political scientist, and we wanted to write a book that was about government bad and markets good, and so we talk about this cooperation and coercion, and we start off by saying, look, anytime humans get together to do anything as a group, we organize ourselves in one of two ways. Either cooperatively, we come together voluntarily, or coercively. Somebody says, this is what you're going to do, and you do it. And as the book progressed, it wasn't working. We get to the last chapter and things just aren't fitting together. And we realized this is not a story about coercion bad and cooperation good. Rather, it's a story of humans have these two tools in front of them, cooperation and coercion. Sometimes, not all the time, in fact, very little of the time, but sometimes coercion is the right tool. Cooperation generally is the right tool. And so the key to a healthy society is knowing which approach to bring to which type of problem.
And I'm going to just put it out there. So does this work on all levels? In a business that you may be running, a group of people that you know, and all of those things?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Now businesses are an interesting case, because you look at that, you say, well, that's a coercive because my boss tells me what I have to do. Actually, it's not. It's a cooperative venture, because at any point you can say, I've had enough, I'm leaving. You can walk away. You can't do that with government. If I don't like what's going on, I don't like the fact they tell me I have to pay taxes, I really can't walk away. I mean, you can make noise about, well, you can leave the country, you can go somewhere else, but that's incredibly expensive, and you have to get the government's permission to do it in the first place. But this is the basic difference between cooperation and coercion. Either we come together voluntarily, as long as things work out, we continue to do it. If they don't, we walk away. Versus coercion, where you're just going to do what you're told, and if you don't like it, there's force behind the edicts.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I always love to run into people who tell me about how Social Security, I don't know if you even, but when they say, well, it's voluntary. Well, there's nothing voluntary about it.
No, there's nothing. There's nothing voluntary about it. And if you doubt me, try not paying your payroll taxes and see what happens. You'll realize very quickly it's not a voluntary system. And this is one of the problems when we use coercion. So here we have a situation. We've got a problem we want to solve, which is people reach retirement age and they don't have enough money. They can't survive. And so what we've brought to the mix is coercion in the form of Social Security. We call it the safety net. And it's actually the wrong tool for the job. The right tool is cooperation. And this is something we did in this country up until the government took over the whole retirement industry with Social Security, we had mutual aid societies. You join a mutual aid society, it's a voluntary organization, you pay dues to it, and if you become injured, you can't work, the mutual aid society takes care of you. You become retired, you can't feed yourself, the mutual aid society takes care of you. It's a voluntary relationship. This worked very well prior to Social Security. And I say prior to Social Security because, I mean, you can't compete with coercion. So now, I'm not going to join a mutual aid society because I've got Social Security. I'd rather not have Social Security, but I don't have a choice.
So how does this apply today? Because we see some rather big waves hitting and crashing on the beach and all of those types of things. So how does it apply today? Because I see a lot more coercion than cooperation going on.
You do see a lot of coercion, and oddly, it comes from the people who are perhaps the first to tout the benefits of diversity. Because with coercion, what you're really doing is taking an anti-diversity position. What you're saying is that we're all the same. And if I come to a conclusion that this particular solution is good, perhaps it's good for me, I'm going to impose it on you in a coercive environment. Well, what have I just done? I've just assumed that there is no diversity between us. My preferences are the same as your preferences. My constraints are the same as your constraints. And so you have problems. I give you a good example of this. This is minimum wage. We talk about the fight for 15 and raising the federal minimum wage $15 an hour. Look, there are some places in the country where $15 an hour is a low wage. If you're a waiter in Manhattan, $15 is nothing. But in Appalachia, $15 is a huge wage. Now, what have we done? We're taking this one size fits no one and trying to apply it to everybody coercively, and you end up with bad solutions.
I always find it interesting that the people who want to push for this have never had to make a payroll and pay people on a regular basis, do not understand what is going on. When I hear someone like I won't call out a specific politician, Hillary Clinton, and have her say, well, maybe you shouldn't be in business if you can't pay that. And I look at that saying, and what is the absurdity of that? Because there are lots of people who are running startups right now, a variety of sizes that may grow into massive businesses. Most of them will not make it. I mean, that's my arena of business, and those people are working for free. I mean, those people they're actually, it's negative wages because they're not getting paid and they're using their precious resource, which is time. So I would have to agree with you. It is a one size that fits not. I always like to point out to somebody that it would be the same as the one size fits all pair of jockey shorts, and you have a jockey and a sumo wrestler, and clearly they should not be wearing the same article of clothing. At least
that's
not around me.
Right. And you said this thing which I've heard people say repeatedly, that if a business can't afford to pay the minimum wage, it has no business being in business. Well, hang on a second, because a worker is really a business. A worker is someone who sells his labor to a customer. We call that customer an employer, but that's really what a worker is. It's a person selling his labor. Now, if you're going to take the position that a business that can't afford to pay its workers minimum wage shouldn't be in business, then by symmetry, a worker who can't manage to get an employer to pay him a living wage shouldn't be working at all. Now, if the argument fits on one side, it should fit on the other. Now, of course, nobody wants to make that second argument, but that's precisely the point. I think we go off the rails here when we think, and this error goes all the way back to Karl Marx and probably even further back. We imagine that capital, buildings, land, machinery, entrepreneurship just falls out of the sky.
Right.
The business owner's got to be compensated for that sort of thing. And, you can look at a business and you can see a business earning a profit. And what do? We point to this guy and say, he's making a profit. This is bad. We should take some of it. And then when times are bad, this guy's earning a loss. And we say, well, if you can't afford to pay the minimum wage, you should be out of business. And we're forgetting the fact that the business owner has invested his time, his energy, his money, his livelihood in building up this business and takes a tremendous amount of risk doing that. None of that shows up on the employee's radar. If I don't like this job, I can just tomorrow go somewhere else. The business owner can't do that.
One of the things I've always pushed back on, and I know that this is, you talk about almost a level of Cervantes and tipping at windmills, but I would love to see where they actually give every resident in the United States, every citizen gets a tax bill at the end of the year. There is no number at the bottom they have to pay because they've already paid it, but it shows all of the tax that has been paid. And the example that I would use is, I don't want to just keep us stuck in the Social Security group, but that the whole point of, I can't imagine how many people do not understand that they're only paying half of their Social Security because the other half is paid by your employer. And I run into people all the time who went, "Oh, I never knew that." Well, go start a business and you find out that you're paying the self-employment tax. You're paying all of the other taxes. So I don't know if Antony, you could support that, but I would love to have that tax bill show up every year, or maybe just before election time.
Oh,
so we see how much it's going to cost you.
Yeah, I'm with you. In fact, I'd go one step further, and that is do away with tax withholding entirely, so that on April 15th, everybody's got to write a check to the federal government. Our government would shrink by 30% overnight if that were the case. But we're not aware of how much we're paying because it's taken out before we ever see our paycheck.
Right. And what once gone, you never know what happens. And there you go. Well, let's talk about something that's not controversial at all. We seem to have, and we used to call it the printing press. There's no printing presses anymore. We've now distilled it to an algorithm and an entry on a spreadsheet up in the cloud somewhere. But let's talk about the massive amount of money that's being printed, not only in the United States, but globally. And what does that mean to an economist like you? It has to just be mind-boggling.
This is something that I've been talking about literally for decades. And what we're seeing now is the most recent in a set of falling dominoes. And the dominoes began when the federal government just decided it's going to spend more on a regular basis than it brings in. We're going to run deficit after deficit after deficit. And we get to the point that we get trillion-dollar deficits, and now we're into multi-trillion-dollar deficits. And what happens? Well, the federal government's got to finance this, and the way it finances is by borrowing. Well, here's the problem. Our federal government has borrowed so much money that there's almost nowhere left it can go to borrow more. Now, their foreign governments will loan more to the United States, Americans will loan more to the federal government, but the amount they're loaning is getting smaller and smaller compared to how much the federal government needs to borrow. There's literally no place else on the planet our government can go to borrow money. So what does it do? It turns to the lender of last resort. That's the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve, what's it do? It prints money and loans it to the federal government. Well, that's a problem because when the Federal Reserve prints money, we get inflation. Now, people will point out, rightly so, and they'll say, well, hang on, Davies, where's the inflation? The Federal Reserve's been printing dollars for the past 10 years, and I'm not seeing the inflation. I argue we are seeing it, although we don't call it inflation. What's been happening is the Federal Reserve, as it prints money, that money has been going primarily into financial markets, not into goods and services markets. And when we calculate inflation, prices of financial assets don't count. Right. And so you see inflation numbers are kind of constant, things are looking good. And over on the financial side, what do you see? You see a rising stock market. And people cheer and say, look, the stock market's going up. This is great. Well, yeah, if it's going up because we're becoming more productive, that is great. But I argue it's been going up simply because the Federal Reserve has been printing money. It's inflation. And when people finally start selling off those assets and that money comes into the goods and services market, you're going to start to see some serious inflation like we have been seeing since April of this year.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because you're right. We have lots of high numbers, and if you look at some of the the unicorn stocks that are out there where people are valuing things that it used to take years for a company to be worth $1 billion, and now overnight you can go toss an IPO out there and now it's worth $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion. I mean, come on. I mean, if you want to go out and I help businesses go out and raise money. I am involved in buying and selling businesses, and if you go and say to somebody, oh, I'm trying to stand up a fund and we're going to raise $7 million, they look at you and go, what's wrong with you? What do you mean 7? I mean, why isn't there an extra couple of zeros
Right.
And by the way, people are chasing lots of bad deals because of it. And it'll be interesting when that happens, or when it gets back to some level of normalization. But we are living in a point in time where we can live in the fantasy for just a little bit longer. Maybe we all sneak by this time, but we'll see what's going to happen. So what's your sense about where this goes in the next 2-3 years, considering that there's right now, as we're recording this, that there's contemplating that, well, maybe we're only going to have another $3.1 trillion infrastructure bill go through. I mean, where does this end? Is this like one of those kind of thuds that happens when somebody hits the ground?
Well, I think it runs as long as voters are willing to tolerate it. And what politicians have found is that voters are willing to tolerate deficits. And so they'll continue to pile it on. You're going to see more and more calls for things like free education and free healthcare and UBI and these sorts of things. And politicians will keep pushing this until voters say that's enough. We don't want to see any more deficits. Well, the problem is voters should have put their foot down a couple of decades ago. They didn't. So what are we going to see? My back of the envelope calculation is that if things progress the way they have been progressing, we're going to be facing in this country persistent year after year inflation of around 10 to 15%.
Wow.
Which it doesn't sound like a lot compared to like Greece having 1,000% and Venezuela having billions of percent inflation. But compared to what we're used to in this country, that's a significant amount. In fact, the last time we saw inflation like that was in the recession at the early 1980s, when mortgage rates were like 20%. That's right. What you get when you have inflation like that.
Well, and that is kind of an interesting time, because I can tell you, having lived through that, having had my father in the owning a machine shop, go try to lease, go get a lease to buy a piece of equipment at that point in time, and right. You were it would have been cheaper to get, because in those days there were caps on credit cards, believe it or not like today. But there are caps on credit cards, and lease rates were higher than credit card rates just to go out and buy a piece of equipment. So you've been on, in this path, you've seen this. So give us a sense of what can an individual do as far as ordering their own life and becoming more aware of these things, and maybe being that person who helps others understand it, so we can slow this, big giant ball from crashing around.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that sounds trite, but it really is the answer. And the answer is, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, say, look, this is a situation. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Printing more dollars doesn't create more goods and services. It just prints more pieces of paper.
Right.
You don't have any more food, you don't have more clothing, you don't have more houses than you had before. And somebody at some point has got to pay for this. I liken it to the idea in physics of the perpetual motion machine. And people are always looking for, if I just tweak the machine like this, I can get perpetual motion. And no, it's not possible. Not because there's something wrong with your design, but because it's simply impossible. And so too here, this is the exact same thing. You can keep on printing money. You're not going to create more goods and services. What you're going to create is inflation. And so helping other voters, helping your neighbor become aware of this, that when the politician says, elect me, I'll give you free college, it's not free. What he's doing is forcing somebody else to pay for it. And so too with UBI and free healthcare and anything else.
Well, and the absurdity of free education, in my opinion, is that you have to have people who are motivated. They have to be ambitious. They have to actually do the work. They have to actually go out and get a degree that has some level of marketability.
Yep.
Got it. So maybe you can touch upon that, because we've got a lot of what are called now sciences. And I can't do a great Bernie Sanders impersonation, so I'll leave it at that. But we have all these people who say they're scientists, and you look at them and you go, they're scientists like I'm an auto repair guy.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think the thing to keep in mind is this: a college degree is either valuable or it isn't. If it's valuable, you'll be able to earn enough with that college degree to pay off the student loan. So you don't need free college. If it's not valuable, there's no point in producing this college major because it's actually a waste of resources. So either way, there's not a compelling argument here for the government to step in and start funding higher education. Now, I can tell you what's actually going to happen. If indeed we get to a point where we have quote unquote free college, and what that really means, where the rubber hits the road, is students will go to college, they won't get tuition bills, instead the taxpayer will end up paying for it through higher taxes. What that really means is we're going to end up in a situation where the cost of college goes up. Because why? A bunch of people who currently are on the fence, maybe I should go to college, maybe not. Going to college is a no-brainer. It doesn't cost you anything. Worst case scenario, it's a 4-year paid vacation. So all of a sudden, there's going to be a deluge of people into higher education. That's going to drive the price of education up even further. And then what happens? Within the university, all of a sudden, you're going to have a bunch of faculty who are teaching in subject areas that have little market value, saying to the students, look, come and take a degree in this underwater basket weaving, and we're going to make your 4 years easy. You're going to get through this. And you get through this, you've got a degree that has no value to the rest of society. And what's happened in the university? The university has now hired a whole bunch of faculty to teach things that have no value. This is what happens when you disconnect any product from the profit loss feedback of the marketplace. Higher education is already almost entirely insulated from profit loss of the marketplace. Making college free will make it completely insulated.
I got into a really interesting, heated discussion with actually it's a business partner of mine, friend of mine. And we were talking about, we were traveling together at the time, and the Obama administration had shut down ITT technical schools as being an abomination. They had gotten a lot of money from, veterans and all that. And I understand, when you're a for-profit business and the government opens up the big checkbook, it's, it can go over the top. Got that. But what I said to him is, I said, look, if you applied the same standards that that administration applied to ITT Tech, and you applied it to higher education, and you said, how many of these people who go into this kind of degree program end up with more money? I mean, if you teach somebody to be an IT tech, at least we know that they're not going to be a barista, and they're going to actually be able to connect computers together. If you teach somebody how to be a welder, we know that they're not going to be sitting there saying, do you want fries with that? I said, at least that way we can show some level of marketability.
Yeah, and I think there's a reasonable comeback to all of this. And the comeback that you'll get is people saying things, well, but hang on. It's valuable to learn multiple languages. It's valuable to be educated in literature. It's valuable to be educated in art and all of these things. To which I respond, yes, it's valuable to the person receiving the education. The question we're asking here is it valuable to society? Because that's who would be picking up the tab. And we have a measure. It's not a perfect measure, but it's the best measure of how valuable an education is to society. And that measure is the wage rate employers are willing to pay you to do jobs that require that education. And we're back to the beginning of, if you can't earn enough with your education to pay for a college loan, your education is actually destroying resources in society. It's not a net addition, it's a net subtraction.
Well, and interestingly enough, and this is a headline that I don't think we're ever going to see, is that we're never going to see this headline, which is unemployment up, libraries jammed, additional security called. Because during the pandemic, I talked to a lot of people who were, another Netflix thing, another this, and I said to all of them, did you learn another language? It isn't just a spoken language. Did you learn how to program something? Did you learn how to use this? Did you do this? Did you do that? How many words did you? You now have all this time. You have this time. Right. What are you doing with that time? And I talked to a lot of people who, again, because of themselves, they were now sitting on the couch, and I'm like, so this is the time that you need to start running fast and start moving quickly and intellectually moving. Making this available for free makes no sense to me on a person who has no inclination to want to go out there and better themselves and become more competitive. I said,
Right.
the person who's out there shooting baskets every day who wants to get great at basketball isn't doing it because every time they shoot it, they go, okay, I'm this many credits closer. It's because they're attempting to better themselves.
Right, right. And I want to head off a criticism here. And the criticism someone would make to our conversation is, well, look, here's a couple of educated guys, and it's easy for them to say that. But what about, the poor student who comes from a poor family and can't afford to go to college? What about this student? And to which I respond, well, hang on. There's a difference between financing education and affording education. Affording education is, when I'm finally done, am I earning enough to pay off the loans that I had?
Right.
Financing it is a different matter. And financing it is there someone out there who will loan me the money so that I can get the education now and be able to pay it back later? Financing is available to anybody, from the richest to the poorest. And that's the thing that stands in the way of you getting into a college. The financing is there. The question we're talking about is the affordability. That is, should you be, given that you've got the financing, should you be studying underwater basket weaving? The answer is no. You're wasting your time. In fact, I'll tell you, and I've looked at the numbers on this, there's a handful of college majors, and by handful I mean maybe a dozen college majors, that actually are worth less than a high school diploma. That is, after the 4 years that you spend studying this dozen majors, you actually have less market value than you had when you started.
Well, that's a list that maybe we need for another book.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I'll share with you a story that during the internet boom, the internet bubble, the explosion of it all. I was actually the tech evangelist, or I was the evangelist for a high tech startup out of MIT. You may have heard of those guys. It's a little school in Massachusetts. And I'm sitting on the plane. I'm flying out of Boston, and I'm on my way back west because I live in the West Coast. And I'm sitting next to an associate professor at Harvard, and I'm talking to her about this thing called the internet. By the way, at one point in time, I used to tell people about the internet, and they would look at me as if I was describing fire, and they had never seen fire before. Okay, so I tell her, listen, at some point in time, really soon, Harvard needs to get online. Harvard needs to offer classes online. We need to change the educational system, and in fact, decouple that everybody has to, march away to Mecca, that you can actually go in and use technology. And then that way, if somebody is in some poor Appalachia or wherever, they can go get access. And she looked at me and says, well, Harvard's never going to do that. We're never going to cheapen it. Well, here's the sadness for me, because that's what, 20, 30 years. I mean, it makes me feel older. But what's really upsetting, and I want your insight on it, is that we haven't even gotten close to progressing that way. If you want to make it available to everybody, first off, record everything, and then start finding ways to deliver that in a meaningful way that somebody watches the lectures, they are engaged, there's the forum, they actually have to do the work, and then they actually get tested. By the way, for you who are wondering why testing is such a scary thing, it's because you're always being tested. Okay, I'm going to take a breath because, Antony, I'd like you to talk about that, because we're not even close to that today. We're still building buildings. To who?
Yeah, we are. And I think it's one of the, if there are positives to come out of COVID, this is one of them. I think it pushed us 10 years down the road closer to that ideal that you're describing. But part of the problem is these things you're describing already exist. Someone can go out and with just YouTube in a browser can learn everything you need to learn to have, my field's economics, to have an economics degree. Now, you don't get anybody saying, okay, well, you've completed an economics degree, but you could. I'm online, I have videos online and so forth, and I would be happy to set up a whole set of links and saying, look, you do all this stuff, you learn this stuff, and I'll even test you, and I'll sign off and say, yes, when you're done, you now have mastered everything that someone who has an economics degree would master. But here's the problem. The problem is even my signature as a PhD isn't going to be counted as an accredited degree. And
right.
here you bump up against the guild system. For that piece of paper to have value, you have to be an accredited university. And how do you get accredited? You find other universities to come and bless you and say, yes, you're accredited. But notice what's happened. You have to have the existing universities admit you into their guild before your degree is counted as accredited. And of course, they have an incentive to prevent you from doing that. If I invested in buildings and libraries and tons of faculty, I could probably get accredited. If it's just me with my degree and the internet, and I'm going to give you some advice and give you a test, there's no way universities will accredit me. Why? Because I can deliver education on pennies on the dollar for what they're charging. They will not allow that.
And you just said something that was so important. And if for the listeners, if you haven't picked up on it, is that anything that you see that there is scarcity, you will almost always find a guild, and that guild is going to protect what I call a rice bowl. And in fact, when I work with my clients, I always send them a rice bowl, empty. Of course, I say, just keep understanding that every customer you have has a rice bowl. Every employee has a rice bowl. You have a rice bowl. It's a great metaphor. And what you're describing is the guild has a rice bowl that they're trying to protect, and they do not want anyone else to do that. I mean, we take a piece of legislation like one of my least favorites, which was Obamacare, which, of course, whenever I meet somebody who triumphantly says on the left, and I don't know your opinion of it, but who triumphantly says, well, listen, it's healthcare. And I said, it's a tax. And they go, no, it's not. And I said, it's a tax. No, it's not. I said, it's a tax because it would be struck down because it wasn't a tax until we got to the Supreme Court. And John Roberts said, I will not strike it down because if it is a tax, then Congress can pass any tax they want to pass, however foolish or ridiculous. And the Obama administration said, it's a tax, but we have a hard time. And I'm going to sweep you up into this. So if I do, okay. We need to say to people, it's a tax. Now, what I said to people is, listen, if the administration really does want to lower the cost curve, here's what we do. Part of Obamacare, immigration reform. We're going to import 1 million new doctors a year for 5 years from around the globe. Guess what? Prices would go down. But the guild would surely not like that because they have a nice, cozy situation. And I have doctors who are friends. I have doctors who are clients. But I'm going to tell you, they got a guild. They got a really good guild.
Yeah, this is absolutely right. And you can see this in the numbers. If you go back, and you have to go back to prior to Obamacare, because now everything's kind of standardized, right? But if you go back prior to Obamacare, when states could do their own thing, there were some states that enforced this guild system. So they would have strict laws saying things like, you cannot, if you're buying insurance in Pennsylvania, you may not buy insurance from an insurer who's based outside of Pennsylvania. And why would they have such a law? Well, the argument is, well, we're going to protect the consumer because if you have problems with your insurance company, you want them to be local so you could deal with this. No, what was really going on is the insurance companies co-opted the state legislature and said, look, set up these laws because it gives us a guild, a fiefdom. It prevents competition from people outside. And so you can see states that imposed more restrictions like this, the cost of insurance in those states was significantly higher than states that didn't. And by significantly, I mean like 3 or 4 times the price of what you get in states that did not have this. And you're absolutely right. This is, if you see a problem with rising prices and you're wondering what's going on, look for guilds, look for government restriction of competition. That's almost always the answer.
And it works. And that gets back to your book, which is that is the coercion part, because
that's the coercion. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And what we should be doing here is leaving things to cooperation, like we do with car insurance. If I find a better deal from an insurer in Washington State, I can, with a few clicks of my mouse, I can do that. I can purchase that insurance. And so nobody's wandering around asking, why is car insurance so expensive? Well, maybe some people do, but we don't have it it's not a big national conversation like it is with healthcare. Why? The difference is one's cooperative, one's not.
Exactly. All right. So at FreedomFest, I mean, you and I think we could go back and forth, and I love what you're saying. I mean, I'm excited. And, oftentimes when I'm going to do an interview and somebody says, well, he's an economist, you go, well, which kind of, which kind are we going to get? Which one,
Right.
But I like your energy. I mean, great energy. So what are you going to talk about at Freedom Fest?
Well, I'll be giving a couple of talks, one with my co-author, James Harrigan. We'll be talking about our book, Cooperation and Coercion, and I'll be giving another talk on why the world is becoming a better place. And this talk is an antidote to all of this stuff you keep hearing over and over again about how the world is going to hell and it's horrible and our grandparents had a better life than we did. Oh. It's all complete nonsense. Now, there are some ways in which the world's gotten worse, but 90% of the ways you look at the world is, we are living in a magical time compared to where people lived a generation or two ago.
Yes, and I would agree with you wholeheartedly. I can't wait to hear that one. And by the way, if you have never been to Freedom Fest before, what you'll discover is that you will have the tyranny of choice, as I like to call it. And the tyranny of choice is that you're going to be sitting there saying, I want to go hear Antony Davies talk, but I also want to go hear this person and this person, and this person. And of course, right now with him, live here, I'm going to say, you got to go see Antony. You got to go see
Absolutely, you should.
Absolutely, you should. But what I'm also going to tell you is that if you have not considered buying the USB key that they will send you later with all of the sessions, then it is foolish not to do that, because this is great information. You're going to get more diversity of opinions and insights and discussion, and you'll see a lot of cooperation. You'll see a lot of, I would say a little bit of gentle arm twisting to try to get people's points across. But I would say you're going to see a lot more cooperation than anything else. Also, you're going to be there and have your book, I hope.
We'll be there. We'll have our book. And I also have another book that will be there, Understanding Statistics. And I apologize for the title because it's a horrible title. The book is about, it's not about, well, it is about statistics, but it's not about teaching you how to do statistics. It's teaching people how to understand it when other people quote statistics. So if you're someone that you hear people on the news, a talking head saying this is true and the other thing is true, this book will set you straight.
Well, and that maybe this is the antidote to my favorite book that I tell clients to pick up all the time, which is called Lie with Statistics by Hoff. And if you've never read that book, well, I'm not going to say that you shouldn't read Antony's book. You should read Antony's book. I have not had a chance to, and I do want to pick it up, but I'm going to tell you that How to Lie with Statistics, you will get shocked. And this is not a new book. This is a book that was written, I believe, in the 1950s. And you start looking at it and you go, ooh, that's how they're slipping one by me.
Yeah. So to pair it up, I would say this book is better. My book is better titled How to See Through the Lies.
There you go. Well, and of course, to do that, I mean, so there's two ways to it. You can either get that book or what we can do is we always have these available and ready. So that way you're ready. You've got those rose-colored glasses. You can always see that things are always getting better. But in fact, I agree with you that we are living in magical times, especially when you see how much access we have to information. I think that we have a tendency to take things like that for granted. COVID hit. We were launching my book, and then we actually wrote a second book, which was called Remote Work for a Better World. And I was actually invited to speak to Peruvian entrepreneurs. Now, okay, who knew? And they called, they said, okay, we have to do a pre-call. We had to test things out. And they said, well, here's our problem. We only have so much bandwidth that we can give. So we have to cut off how many people can be there. Now, I speak not a lick of Spanish. My business partner, Gabe Batista, from Colombia, perfect. But go in there, speak. We're gonna listen to you. We're gonna do some translation, and then we're gonna translate it for people. But we can only have so many people because we don't have enough bandwidth for Peru. So if you're sitting there saying, "Oh, we live in really tough times," there are people in Peru who are waiting in line to hear these things, and you need to think in terms of how. And I'll just use the phrase: you have to think of how blessed you are, how lucky you are that we have that. And of course, absolutely. To go to an event like Freedom Fest and do that. Have you been to Freedom Fest before, Antony?
I have. A couple of years ago, I met William Shatner, which was the high point of my year.
Me too. So I probably have rubbed elbows with you.
You probably did, yeah.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions, and we're going to do a quick wrap up. And I'm going to give everybody directions on how to get to Freedom Fest. Now, and you live in Pittsburgh, so these are maybe germane for you if you haven't done it. So if you haven't signed up yet, it's July 21st through the 24th. July 21st to 24th. It's Rapid City, South Dakota, and I'm going to give you directions on how to get there. A couple of rapid fire questions for the good professor. Is there a way out of this crises, this monetary crisis that's beyond our borders, by the way? I mean, the world is awash in debt without going through an inflationary cycle. Do you see any way out of it without us having to go through and either, devalue the money or go through rapid inflation?
There's only one way out, and that is that some land-breaking new invention, discovery comes along on the order of the internet, maybe fusion power. Beyond that, mathematically, it's just not possible.
Okay. So, and then when you look out to the future, though, and you've already touched on, because one of your talks is going to be about how wonderful the times are. Give me one or two things in your own experience that really exemplify why this is the best time that you could have ever lived.
Oh, yeah. And this is the problem. You see, there are so many examples, we don't even notice them. We talk about, for example, the rising price of healthcare. If you don't like the price of healthcare, you can have 1970s healthcare, no problem. Just refuse every treatment, every drug that didn't exist after 1970. And you'll find nobody wants to do that. Why? Because although the price of healthcare has gone up, the quality has gone up way more. Even a poor person today can go into a drugstore and buy a cure for a disease for pennies, for dollars, that before even the richest Americans couldn't buy. That's how wealthy we have become.
Well, so that's one example, and then give me one more, and then I'll give you directions. We'll wrap it up.
One more example of how the world is becoming a better place. This conversation. I'm sitting here, in my home. Actually, I'm in a hotel talking to you, and you're in the other side of the planet, and we're doing it for basically the cost of the electricity, a few pennies. When I was a kid, this phone call would have cost multi-tens of thousands of dollars. Literally, pretty much every single American, by every single, I mean like 95% plus, can pick up their phone and call video someone anywhere on the planet at a cost that the billionaires of the 1970s could not afford.
Excellent example. All right, so here's how you get to Freedom Fest if you don't know already. All right, so here's what you do. If you live in the United States, you locate Interstate 90. If you do not know how to locate Interstate 90 and you don't know the interstate highway system, go back to your fourth grade teacher and demand a refund. Once you find Interstate 90, determine, are you east or west of Rapid City, South Dakota? And if you are east, head west until you get the wide spot in the road before Mount Rushmore. 78,000 people call that home, and it's called Rapid City, South Dakota. And there's going to be a whole bunch of us right there. If you are west, because I don't want to leave you out, just in case you need that feedback, head east until you go past Mount Rushmore, and then you get to Rapid City. And that's how you do that. Any last words before I let you go?
Well, I look forward to seeing whoever's out there at Freedom Fest. And just by all means, if you see me, come up and shake my hand and say hello.
Excellent. And with that, this is John Paul Mendoza for It's a Paul World, and our guest today, our special guest today, and very good sport, Antony Davies. And he is going to be talking about not only his new book, but he has his other book. And if you have any interest in figuring out how to get through this next crisis, you're going to want to listen and understand what he's talking about.